presentation up as well. Thank you for the kind introduction, Jan. And thank you to Cristiano and the whole team at the University of Massachusetts for their invitation. I'm based in Switzerland. It is now 5 p.m. here, so you are what is standing between me and my weekend. So I very much hope that this is going to be an interesting and exciting session for all of you, and that we're going to have a pleasant ending of the week all together. Today I'm going to focus on professionalizing humanitarian interpreting or interpreters, and I have added a question mark to my title because whether and how humanitarian interpreting can and should be professionalized is very much at the center of this talk, and I'm looking forward to exchanging with you during the Q&A on this as well. Just to give you an idea about the context, what is humanitarian interpreting? Why am I talking about this? Well, humanitarian organizations very often operate in non-Anglophone environments, in multilingual environments, or even in highly multilingual environments. And these organizations often involve mobility of people from one context to another. So someone from Switzerland might go to a different country as a humanitarian aid worker and not speak the language of that country. And therefore, humanitarian organizations routinely rely on interpreters to communicate with their beneficiaries and also with other parties that they interact with, such as local authorities or other stakeholders in the country of intervention. Together with my colleague Leila Kerbish, we came up with a definition of humanitarian interpreting a few years ago. And basically, in order to clearly circumscribe what we mean by this, because humanitarian interpreting is often conflated with other practices such as interpreting in asylum proceedings, community interpreting, healthcare interpreting, and these contexts share a lot of elements. For example, there is medical interpreting in the humanitarian context as well, because there are medical interventions in the field. But there are some things that make humanitarian interpreting sufficiently specific to define it as a concept in its own right. And these specific things are that it takes place within the legal framework of international humanitarian law. That is a term you might or might not have heard about in recent days. I will get back to what that exactly means. Also, international refugee law. And here the word international is important because more often than not, asylum interpreting takes place within the framework of national refugee law or national laws regulating asylum. And the aim of this interpreting practice is to enable humanitarian organizations, to communicate with whoever they need to communicate with, mostly individuals who are beneficiaries. And what is important is that humanitarian interpreting is generally not applicable to interactions between aid workers. So if two aid workers from the same organization communicate, generally that does never involve interpreting. It usually involves, well, either using English as a lingua franca or using the local language or using some kind of third language, but interpreting is very much situated between the organization and whatever lies outside of the organization. And most of these interpreters are either aid workers or beneficiaries. And today I'm going to focus on the aid workers. And they're very much not professional interpreters. As I said, it overlaps with other fields and their fluid boundaries. So I'm hoping that a lot of the things I'm going to mention today are also things that are kind of familiar to you from other contexts that you know well and that you work in. Second thing we need to define after defining what a humanitarian interpreter is what do we actually mean by professionalization or professional interpreter? Does anyone want to quickly tell me what a professional interpreter is and how a professional interpreter is different from a non-professional interpreter? Any ideas?
You guys can use the chat box if you like.
Yeah, in the chat is fine. What are some of the elements that distinguish a professional from a non-professional interpreter? I'll move to the next slide. There's a list. Yes, there's a list of elements that usually come up when we speak of professional versus non-professional. So one idea is training, either formal or informal. And this, I'm not just talking about interpreters, but in generally, what do we mean if we say someone is a professional? When we say he's a professional or she's a professional, this also means a certain level of skills. And yes, I see in the chat people talking about codes of conduct and professional ethics. I have lumped this in here with socialization. So you have acquired a certain idea about what the rules of behavior are. And I've widened it to socialization because for interpreters, it might really be about ethics. And then for electricians, it might be about something else. But the point is every profession has its rules of behavior. A profession, I think, is also different from a job in that a profession also comes with certain aspirations, wanting to build a path, not necessarily a career, but it's something that you look at with a vision for the future. For example, during my studies, in order to fund my studies, I worked as a receptionist, responding to phone calls. And this was very much my job, but it was never my profession because I never had any aspirations of continuing in that field or making that my main source of income. And then remuneration. Remuneration is also important. The process of professionalization is a process of building both skills and revenue in a certain field. Most interpreters, as I mentioned, most interpreters working in the humanitarian field cannot be considered professionals on all these dimensions. Most of them have no interpreter training, point one. There's also little quality control in place to monitor their work. And the outcomes of these interactions are extremely high, right? When we think of humanitarian aid, we think of giving people food and life-saving medicine and emergency surgeries, etc., etc. So it's really important that we are able to communicate with beneficiaries, that beneficiaries can be heard, and that beneficiaries can understand the messages conveyed by the organization. And it thus follows that poor quality interpretation is ethically also problematic because one of the principles of humanitarian work is respect for beneficiaries. It is non-discrimination. It is the ability for beneficiaries to own the process, and all this relies on communication actually being possible. So we may thus ask ourselves, if the stakes are so high, if the ethical implications are so problematic, then why on earth are humanitarian organizations relying on non-professional interpreters? And when I started working on this in 2010, I was convinced very much that this was because an absence of training. That if only these interpreters were trained properly, then everything else would kind of fall into place. And this is the kind of naivety you have when you're in your early 20s. And I have since moved to a deeper understanding of the issue. And my answer now, in my hypothesis now in 2022, is very much that it's complicated. It's more complicated than just the absence of training. But we must understand the humanitarian field itself in order to understand why humanitarian interpreters are generally not professionals. As I mentioned earlier, professionalization involves these different dimensions: training, socialization, aspiration, remuneration, and skills. And just to be clear, I'm very much focusing here on professionalization as a process and not an outcome. So this process is situated on a continuum. You can slowly become more professional. It does not mean that you have to be fully professional. So when I'm talking of professionalizing humanitarian interpreting, I'm simply talking about increasing the level of professionalism, not making every humanitarian interpreter a full-fledged professional. Um, as I mentioned, so the humanitarian field is really what we need to understand in order to understand why interpreters are currently not trained and why, at least in my opinion, this is not likely to change. I use the term humanitarian field in the sense of Bourdieu. Bourdieu was a French sociologist who analyzed basically the dynamics between different parts of society, and he coined something that is called field theory. And he defines different social fields as composed of specific actors with their own norms and values, etc. So don't think of this as a rugby field or whatever sports you play in the US. Think of this as a force field, like a magnetic field. You see, like a tension that goes through society. And so interpreting would be one of these fields. Interpreting would be the professional field of interpreting would involve specific actors, interpreters, employers, trainers, academics. It has specific norms and values, professional ethics, etc. And it has its own, what Bourdieu calls sources of symbolic capital. So for example, knowing your languages very well gives you a certain prestige as an interpreter. Knowing languages well is entirely irrelevant to the professional field of plumbers. Plumbers have other sources of symbolic capital that they value and that they think are important. High-level athletes have other sources of symbolic capital that they value. And it's the same for the humanitarian field. The humanitarian field has its own actors, its own ethics, its own norms, which Bourdieu calls doxa, which is simply the Greek word for norms and values. And it has its own sources of symbolic capital. And like any field, it also has tensions. This is why I'm saying think of it as a magnetic field or a force field. And one of the key tension currently present in the humanitarian field is what kind of north-south relationships do we actually enact? How does the global, the international, relate to the local on the ground? And you have maybe heard about all kinds of debates that have come up in recent years, for example, about decolonizing aid. So when you hear something like decolonizing humanitarian aid, this is what we're talking about. We are saying, okay, there is a heritage in North-South relationships. There's a history of colonialism. There's a history of paternalism. There's a history of the North dominating the South. How do we reverse that? How do we change that? And is humanitarian aid simply replicating this power dynamic, or is it actually something different? So this tension is there in the humanitarian field. And this tension, and another way of phrasing it is also this idea of distance versus proximity. And this is where it becomes interesting for interpreters, because this is something you have all thought about, maybe not in those terms, but how close are we allowed to get to someone, or how far do we need to be from someone in order to do our job? Humanitarian aid workers very much ask themselves this question all the time. And so ultimately, conceptually, the way this tension can be framed is that on one side, there's this idea of neutrality and impartiality. So humanitarian aid organizations, historically, especially the ICRC, which I'm focusing on, have always had this principle, this guiding principle of neutrality and impartiality. And then this is now in tension with a more recent principle. So neutrality and impartiality is the historic one. And now more recently, in recent decades, we have this other side of the coin, which is, well, humanitarian aid should be engaged. It should be participatory. Beneficiaries should very much be involved in the process. We need to stop this neutrality and distance and impartiality. And there you can see that this underlying tension is something that we also find in interpreting, where we also have this tension between neutral interpreters and advocacy or more engaged interpreters. So as I said, in the humanitarian field, there have been several shifts and changes since roughly, I would say, the early 90s. Many things have actually changed since the early 90s. This is really a key moment in time for a lot of concepts, just like sustainable development, etc., etc. And one thing that has changed is the boundaries between humanitarian and development work have become more blurred. There are now many organizations that work kind of in both fields. The separation is not very clear, when historically they were quite distinct and they have different histories. And this has led to concepts that were developed in one field to migrate to the other field. So participation, participatory development. Participation in development has very much existed as a concept since the 70s. But in humanitarian aid, it's quite recent. This idea of participatory approaches was adopted maybe 5 to 10 years ago in humanitarian work. And there are now rights-based approaches also that kind of blur this boundary between the two. And in blurring this boundary, this also has led to a situation where local staff, so the people who are from the country where an intervention takes place, have a much stronger role to play. Because if you say that participation is important and local participation is important, then you need to be able to make contacts with communities. And for that, you need people who are rooted there, who are located there, and who have those contacts. You cannot just parachute in a team of aid workers for 2 months and then fly them out again and expect participation. There's also a professionalization of humanitarian work that has really taken off in the last 20 years. And humanitarian work is now very much a career, which it was initially not necessarily. Um, Initially, humanitarian workers were kind of a collection of slightly crazy people who were not afraid of going into war zones, and often they were doctors, or they were doctors or engineers or professions that thought they could be useful on the ground. And later on, now we have this professionalization in the sense that somebody now can just be a humanitarian aid worker. Like they have actually studied development or humanitarian aid at university, and this is now their main profession. And another phenomenon that we have seen in recent decades as well is that especially international aid workers have increasingly become targets of abductions, terrorist attacks, etc. on the ground. I'm not going to go into detail of why this is the case, but one reason this is the case is that international humanitarian law is generally binding for countries, and we now have a lot of conflicts or wars that involve armed groups that don't necessarily consider these laws to be binding for them. And this has led to international aid workers being more and more withdrawn from the field, from the beneficiaries. So they are now housed in protected compounds that they cannot easily get out of, that no locals can go in, armored vehicles, etc. So they're very separated from the local population, but local aid workers are not. And so this means that the reliance on local aid workers has increased more and more. These are just some general trends to keep in mind as I now focus on interpreting for ICRC. My analysis is based on courses I've run training interpreters for ICRC between 2013 and 2019, a total of over 100 interpreters. The ICRC is a good case study because it is very much the organization that is at the center of the humanitarian field. It's the guardian of international humanitarian law, and its values are very much aligned with the historic humanitarian principles. So they are very much on the side of impartiality and neutrality, and very hesitant to go to the side of advocacy and engagement and activism that you can see in other organizations. I've put the definitions of impartiality and neutrality on the side here, on the slide here as well. You can read them for yourselves because these two terms are slightly different. Each of the terms has a slightly different meaning in the humanitarian context, but it's not that important for this presentation. I've mentioned some developments, global developments since the early 90s earlier, and these developments have also been seen within ICRC. Until 1993, ICRC delegates had to be Swiss citizens. Local staff existed, but they were largely invisible. A lot of them were maybe, the women were often telephone operators, secretaries, office staff. The men were drivers, handymen, field officers involved in food distribution and things like this. And then there was a big shift in 93. ICRC opened to delegates from other nationalities. And this meant that there was a first break in terms of neutrality. Switzerland prides itself as being a neutral country. And the meaning of neutrality became, in the 90s, with the end of the Cold War, very much less important than it had been during the Second World War, for example. Neutrality was no longer seen as something that only the Swiss could do in a given humanitarian field operation. And all expatriate staff were considered to be able to enact the principle of neutrality and impartiality. But local staff were not considered to be the same. So for local staff, it was considered that they could not engage in that certain sensitive humanitarian operations could not be entrusted to local staff. Currently, from 2015 onwards, the ICRC enacted a policy called One Global Workforce, and they have now very much tried to decentralize more and more and increase the recognition for local staff. First of all, they have much more local staff now than they used to have before. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think local staff outnumber international staff 10 to 1. And the ICRC distinguishes between two staff categories: mobile staff, so these are the international staff, mobile because they move around, and resident staff because they are resident in one place, so they stay put. These two categories have very different working conditions. The pay is very much higher for mobile staff and lower for resident staff. And there are a few other details as well. And currently in ICRC or in the humanitarian field, there's even a debate on whether impartiality and neutrality should remain associated with this idea of the foreign aid worker, or whether neutrality is still a relevant concept at all for humanitarian aid. Humanitarian interpreters now within ICRC. The interesting thing about interpreters is that you will find interpreters amongst both staff categories. So the internationals and the locals, the mobile and the resident staff. But they're not used for the same things. So there are some situations where only mobile staff can interpret. And these are all the situations that involve a high degree of sensitivity and where it is considered that the organization needs to be as impartial and as neutral as possible. So one of the things ICRC does that not many people are aware of is they do prison visits to check on the detention conditions for detainees. And during these prison visits, they use exclusively mobile interpreters, so foreigners, because they would not want local staff to enter a prison that is run by the government of the country that they are a citizen of, because that can put them in a kind of vulnerable position. And they use resident staff in situations that require a high level of engagement with the local community. So, for example, if they are running a health information session in a IDP camp for internally displaced civilians, then they will just use local staff to interpret. They will not use mobile or foreign staff to interpret. And to understand now, to get back to this idea of professionalization. So we have the mobile and the local interpreters, and neither of them are trained. And to understand why, we need to go to the very beginning of the process, how interpreters are recruited. Now, ICRC operates in countries affected by armed conflict, and to a lesser degree in countries affected by natural disasters. And ICRC obviously operates in countries where there is a gap in terms of humanitarian aid needs that cannot be filled by local authorities for whatever reason. So of course, ICRC tends to operate more often than not in countries that are situated in what is unfortunately called the global south. And so they need the languages of these countries. They need their interpreters to speak Kirundi, to speak Tamashek, to speak Burmese, Tigrinya, Hausa, Peul, or Khmer. They don't need interpreters who speak German, Swedish, or Danish. And they have changing or unpredictable language needs because a conflict can break out at any moment, and you don't necessarily know 6 months in advance that you're going to need interpreters for this language or this other language in 6 months. And these interpreters are therefore deployed nearly immediately to their duty station. The mobile staff are recruited as interpreters, so there's a job advertisement for interpreters. And for the resident staff, there's not even any formal interpreter recruitment process. They're just recruited as whatever they are recruited, field officers, nurses, etc. And then it's just taken for granted that they speak the local language and that they can also interpret. So we only have one specific recruitment process for mobile interpreters. This is a job advertisement. This is an excerpt from a real job advertisement. University degree is an advantage, not even a requirement. 2 years of professional experience as an interpreter is an advantage, not a requirement. Excellent command of English or French and the interpreted language is a requirement. So language skills are a hard requirement. Interpreter training, interpreter experience is not a hard requirement. There are, in addition to this, there is another hard requirement, which is that interpreters must not originate from the country of the interpreted language. So let that sink in for a minute. I don't know how many people you know who speak Tigrinya, but somehow by miracle have no family ties and are not originally from a country that speaks Tigrinya. Very few people. There are not many people who fulfill this requirement, and this is a hard requirement. So all of a sudden, ICRC has to find people who speak Tamashek or who speak Khmer, but who are not Cambodian and who are not from one of the several countries where Tamashek is spoken, let's say Niger. Quite difficult to find. And they have to master the languages. And then the soft requirement, translator or interpreter training and translator-interpreter experience, they're just thrown out of the window most of the time because you cannot even fill the position by just applying the two hard requirements. So, and in addition to that, I mean, for most of the languages ICRC uses, there's not even a lot of training opportunities in terms of interpreting. Yes, some of them could be in some countries trained as community interpreters, but not even all countries have institutionalized training for community interpreters. There are no conference interpreter training programs for these languages, as far as I know. And in addition, in the job advertisement, it clearly says that candidates must be motivated by humanitarian work, able to work in a dangerous environment, etc., etc. So ICRC here is very much recruiting humanitarians, not interpreters. They are recruiting aid workers who know languages. And the people who apply to these positions are people who actually what they want when applying to be an interpreter at ICRC. People don't want to be interpreters. That's not the reason they apply. They apply because they want to work in the humanitarian field and they have no relevant training or experience to do so because they studied history and literature, or they studied Indian cinema and learned Hindi, or they backpacked through Thailand for 2 years after high school, and now they want to work, for an organization, and they have no relevant skills other than the fact that they actually are fluent in Thai, which all of a sudden becomes an advantage. These are just some of the profiles that I've encountered, and so these are people who fulfill the two requirements. Yeah, they have the language, the rare language, and they don't have family ties with the country they're being deployed to. And a particularly interesting case is Africa, sub-Saharan Africa especially. One example here on the list is a Fulani man from Cameroon. So this is interesting. We are very much thinking here, ICRC is very much phrasing this in very Western terms of thinking about citizenship. So they're saying who originate from the country of the interpreted language. Now, in Africa, a lot of language borders don't overlap with country borders. So Fulani, for example, or Fula or Pular, is a language that is spoken in over 20 countries in West Africa by the same ethnic group. So this guy was actually part of the Fulani ethnic group, but he was a citizen of Cameroon, and so he could be deployed to the other 24 countries where Fulani was spoken. And it was still considered that by virtue of being a Cameroonian citizen, he would be neutral in interactions involving local Fulanis, even though he actually shared language and culture and ethnicity with them versus and not with Cameroonians from other ethnic groups. We have a lot of graduates from specific language schools, Oriental studies, African, Asian studies amongst ICRC interpreters. ICRC actually runs recruitment workshops at these different universities as well. There are people who moved around a lot when they were kids and people who just have multiple languages in their family. And so humanitarian interpreting for these people is very much a way of transforming a niche skill. Who in Romania speaks Hindi? Maybe two people. One of them became an interpreter with ICRC. And these are very often people who are primarily motivated by the humanitarian field. They don't want to become an interpreter. They want to become a humanitarian aid worker, or they just want to earn money or just find a job. And this is well-paid employment. Being a mobile interpreter for ICRC is a well-paid and stable job. Resident staff, on the other hand, well, they are recruited as something else, as I said, as nurses, field officers, drivers, secretaries, and they're just expected to interpret as they go along because they know the local language. And they're recruited because of other relevant skills that they have, not because of their language knowledge. And now to take a step back, as I said, interpreters have the specificity that interpreting, is done by people who are mobile and resident staff. But there's a status difference. And this status difference plays out thus. Mobile staff are paid up to 10 times more than resident staff. The reason they're paid more is because they are considered to have cross-context experience, they have a higher education degree, and they have generally more responsible positions within ICRC, and they're deployable across contexts, which also means they have more career options within ICRC and even with other organizations. But mobile interpreters, they're not actually that mobile. Tigrinya is not spoken in 20 different countries. Arabic is. Arabic is an exception. You can be an interpreter for Arabic and move around countries all the time. But for many languages, it means you're stuck in one context. So it means that as a mobile interpreter. So this guy from wherever in Europe who works now in Rwanda, say, he has no career progression there. And his motivation was to work in the humanitarian field. And he realizes that because he knows the local language, he's now tied to this one context that is Rwanda. Whereas all the other mobile staff are constantly moving around. And he realizes, wait a minute, my boss doesn't speak Kinyarwanda. His boss doesn't speak Kinyarwanda. My boss's boss doesn't speak Kinyarwanda. So what I should do in order to climb the ladder is go to a context where I don't speak the local language, because clearly speaking the local language is holding me back in my career progression. And this is exactly what we see in humanitarian interpreters. First of all, as I said, these are people whose professional aspirations are not in interpreting. They are in the humanitarian field. They have no incentive to professionalize because, as interpreters, because they have no career path. They will always be paid the same. They will always do the same tasks if they remain interpreters. And so what they want to do is to use interpreting as a springboard to other positions within the humanitarian field. And the same, by the way, is true for resident staff. One of the biggest jumps you can make within ICRC is from resident staff to mobile staff. So ICRC has a local worker in Ethiopia who is very good, very diligent, speaks very good English. And then one day they say, hey, why don't we deploy you to another context? Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to become a mobile staff and go to the Middle East? And for the guy, that means being paid 10 times more, having a different status. So of course he's willing to do that. But then he will be in a context where he does no longer speak the local language and he's no longer going to be interpreting. So interpreting is associated with being at the lower end of the humanitarian pay scale. This is a reality of the humanitarian field. And symbolic capital, remember I talked about this at the beginning, what makes humanitarian aid workers special and what they admire about other humanitarians is the mobility. So when two people from ICRC meet, it's always the same thing. Where have you worked before? Oh, Bosnia. Yes, I did Bosnia. And then I was in Rwanda. And at the end of the 90s, I was here. And then I went to Afghanistan. And someone who has been with ICRC but been in the same country for 5 years, not that interesting, not that high status, not that prestigious. So moving is very much the thing you need to do. This means most mobile interpreters change jobs after 1 to maximum 3 years. They learn other tasks by working in the humanitarian field. They become qualified as humanitarians. And so there's no incentive for them to become professionalized as interpreters. If we go back to our criteria of professionalization, so training, at the beginning they have none. At the end, they have very little because the training we did for interpreters at ICRC is about 4 days. I wouldn't call that professionalization. Their language skills, they have them before entering the field, and then they acquire a lot of humanitarian knowledge, and they are socialized very much as humanitarian workers, not as language professionals. The code of ethics, even that they abide by, primarily is the code of ethics of the humanitarian field. And their aspirations, their ambitions, remember my receptionist example at the beginning? Interpreting for them is a bit like being a receptionist was for me. That's not where their ambition is. That's not the field they want to evolve in. They want to make a place for themselves in the humanitarian field. And their remuneration as well, as I said, resident staff and mobile staff, they both interpret. They both do exactly the same thing for part of their tasks. Then they do other things. But part of their task is exactly the same. So how come mobile staff can earn 10 times more than resident staff? Well, that's based on their humanitarian status, not based on interpreting. Interpreting is irrelevant here as a variable. So factors constraining the professionalization of humanitarian interpreting. Recruitment is very difficult. People will not be trained when you recruit them. There are no incentives for individuals to become professionalized as interpreters. because they want to move on from there. And there are also no incentives for the organization to heavily invest in professionalization because their language needs are constantly changing, because interpreters move on, and because if you give people interpreter training and then you move them to another country for the next mission where they are not going to be interpreters, then that training was kind of useless. Whereas if you give them training in specific humanitarian skills or humanitarian relevant skills, then they can take those skills from Rwanda to Ethiopia to Azerbaijan, and the organization will really get a high return on investment. Um, so there is maybe for the organization, I feel, a higher incentive to train the users of interpreters. So kind of leave the interpreters untrained, but then really train the humanitarian aid workers to use interpreters in a way that kind of allows them to steer the communication, even if the interpreters are not trained. Um, and so what this means in terms of my initial hypothesis from 2010 is that absence of training opportunities is actually not the reason why humanitarian interpreters are not professionalized. Um, Training initiatives can have an impact if they're very focused, pragmatic, like the short course we did, which is 4 days, and if they focus on the process of professionalization. So they have to focus on making people a bit more professional at what they do, not producing professional interpreters. Um, and in terms of impact, we have to be aware also that the impact of training is generally on the individual. And if the individual leaves, then there will not be a lasting impact on the field, obviously. So full professional training is not practical, not useful for humanitarian interpreters. And I would even argue, given that we're talking about the humanitarian field, it's not necessarily ethical because that is not where the resources of humanitarian organizations need to be spent as a matter of priority. So basically what this means is that as long as this mobility from one country to another remains so important in the humanitarian field, and as long as impartiality remains such a key principle, professionalization of interpreters will be limited. And I believe that interpreter training institutions and maybe also some academics have been a bit too enthusiastic in embracing training as the solution for all challenges relating to humanitarian interpreting. Thank you for your attention.